The police accused Charles Reynolds of a crime he didn't commit, unaware that they had detained a federal prosecutor. Their plan unraveled as quickly as their reputations crumbled. What happened next would shock even the most seasoned observers. But let's start from the very beginning. The sunlit street bustled with life as 35-year-old Charles Reynolds parked his sleek black sedan outside a quaint cafe. Tall, poised, and impeccably dressed in a tailored dark blue suit, he embodied success. His confident stride and composed expression naturally drew glances, including those of two white police officers standing nearby. "Too fancy for this neighborhood," muttered Officer Greg Mitchell, 45 years old, broad-shouldered with a stern face. His younger partner, Jake Carson, 28 years old, struggled to mask his unease. "Maybe we should check it out," Jake suggested, his voice betraying inexperience. Charles entered the cafe calmly. Inside, he sat down with a young woman, Maya, a law student he was mentoring. The two were deeply engaged in discussing her upcoming exam, oblivious to the unfolding events outside. The officers exchanged glances. "Something's off," Greg declared, striding toward Charles's car. Outside, Greg moved closer to the sedan, gesturing for Jake to follow. "A car this fancy in a place like this? Come on, this guy's hiding something," he remarked mockingly. When Charles exited the cafe, he was met with Greg's sharp voice. "Hey, sir, come over here. Show me some ID." Suppressing his irritation, Charles looked at the officers. "On what grounds?" he replied calmly. "We got a complaint about a suspicious person," Greg lied with a deceitful grin. "This is illegal. You have no grounds for this stop," Charles asserted firmly, standing his ground. Greg, however, had no intention of backing off. Grabbing Charles by the arm, he snapped the cuffs onto his wrists. At the same time, Jake began searching the car. Within minutes, Greg held up a small bag of white powder. "Well, lawyer, care to explain this?" he sneered. "You're making a grave mistake," Charles responded coldly, maintaining his composure. By now, a small crowd had begun to gather. Maya, her phone already recording, shouted from the sidewalk, "This is illegal! He hasn't done anything!" But the officers ignored her protests. Charles was led to the patrol car, his demeanor steady despite the situation. "You'll answer for this," he said as the car door slammed shut behind him. The interrogation room at the police station was filled with a tense, suffocating silence. Charles Reynolds sat at the metal table, his hands still cuffed. His gaze was focused, his posture impeccably straight, exuding an unshakable composure despite the absurdity of the situation. Across from him, Greg Mitchell sat with his arms crossed over his broad chest. Behind Greg, Jake Carson lingered uncertainly, casting hesitant glances at his senior partner. "Well, lawyer," Greg began with a sneer, tossing a bag of white powder onto the table. "Why don't you tell us how you plan to distribute this around our city?" Charles arched an eyebrow. His voice was cold and sharp. "This is a setup. Your actions are illegal, and I intend to prove it." "Prove it?" Greg chuckled, shaking his head. "Who's going to believe you? A black man with money and a fancy car? In a neighborhood like this? We know your type." Charles leaned forward slightly, his gaze cutting like a blade. "You've already broken at least 3 laws. I hope you understand that you'll be held accountable for this." Greg's grin widened. "You threatening me? You're nobody here, just another criminal." At that moment, the door burst open. 2 men in sharp black suits entered with purpose. The taller of the two held up a federal badge. "Release Mr. Reynolds, immediately," the man commanded, his voice firm and authoritative. Greg's face froze, his smugness replaced by confusion. Jake took a step back, his expression one of dawning panic. "What? Who are you?" Greg stammered, rising from his chair. "Special Agent John Marshall, Civil Rights Division," the man replied coldly. You just arrested and framed a federal prosecutor. You're in serious trouble." "A federal prosecutor?" Jake's face turned pale, his voice trembling. Greg, on the other hand, struggled to maintain his composure, though the redness creeping up his face betrayed his mounting panic. "Charles Reynolds, Assistant U.S. Attorney," Charles stated, standing slowly as the cuffs were finally removed. His tone was calm, but his words carried the weight of authority. "And your actions are about to be thoroughly investigated." Greg tried to defend himself, his voice louder than necessary. "This is a misunderstanding. We were just doing our job." Charles shot him a piercing look. "You abused your authority, planted evidence, and violated my civil rights. That's not a job. It's a crime." Behind them, Maya stood in the hallway with a group of journalists, her phone camera rolling. Her voice rang out, brimming with emotion. "Smile, officers. This video's already going viral." The entire station seemed to hold its breath. Greg, for the first time, felt a flicker of genuine fear as the reality of the situation hit him. Their plan had collapsed completely. Charles, straightening his jacket with deliberate calm, took a step toward the door. His unwavering gaze as he passed Greg said everything. "Now it's your turn to answer." A crowd of journalists and curious onlookers gathered outside the police station, their cameras and phones pointed toward the entrance. Charles Reynolds was the first to emerge, flanked by 2 federal agents. His tall stature, confident stride, and composed expression amplified the gravity of the moment. Maya walked beside him, holding her phone, live-streaming the event. Behind them, officers Greg Mitchell and Jake Carson followed at a distance, their faces betraying a mix of confusion and fear. Charles stopped in front of the microphones. His voice was firm yet calm, each word deliberate and powerful. "Today serves as a glaring example of how abuse of power and systemic racism continue to poison our law enforcement system. I was unlawfully detained, searched and framed, simply because of the color of my skin." The crowd murmured in response, and the flash of cameras lit up the street. Reporters clamored to ask questions, but Charles raised a hand, commanding silence. "I am an assistant United States attorney, and my duty is to uphold civil rights. These officers overstepped their authority, acted with prejudice, and broke the law. I will ensure they are held accountable." From behind him, Greg took a step forward. "That's not true. We acted within the law," he shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the growing buzz of the crowd. Federal Agent John Marshall stepped forward. "An internal investigation has already begun. Officers Greg Mitchell and Jake Carson have been suspended pending further review." The crowd erupted with noise. Maya turned her camera toward Greg, whose face had turned red with anger, though he said nothing more. Jake, standing next to him, looked as though he wished the ground would swallow him whole. Meanwhile, Maya's footage, from the cafe and the arrest to the press conference, was quickly going viral. Comments flooded in, demanding justice, and Charles Reynolds' name became a rallying cry for combating systemic injustice. Later that evening, in a local television station's conference room, Charles gave his first major interview. "I want to ensure that no one, child, adult, or elder, ever faces this kind of treatment again. This isn't just about me. It's about standing up for everyone who has been a victim of bias and abuse." Back at the police station, chaos ensued. The chief of police convened an emergency meeting. "We can't let this scandal destroy our department," he declared. But the damage was already done. After the interview, Maya stood beside Charles, her expression thoughtful. "You've changed the narrative. This video has already shifted public opinion." Charles offered a faint smile. "This is just the beginning. Final justice." A week after the incident, the police station became the center of a federal investigation. Agents from the Civil Rights Division reviewed evidence, interrogated officers, and uncovered damning details. Greg Mitchell and Jake Carson were summoned to a disciplinary hearing, but their reputations were already destroyed. Maya's viral video, with millions of views, sparked nationwide outrage. Protests erupted with signs reading, "Justice for Charles," "End Police Racism," and "Stop Abuse of Power." The courtroom hearing, Charles stood confidently before the judges. Across from him, Greg and Jake sat in silence as overwhelming evidence was presented. Maya Kelly's video and the internal investigation have proven that these officers planted evidence and violated the Constitution, Charles stated firmly. This behavior destroys trust in law enforcement. The judge announced the verdict. Officers Greg Mitchell and Jake Carson are guilty of abuse of power and evidence tampering. Greg shouted, "This is a setup!" But his outburst was ignored. Jake hung his head, knowing resistance was futile. The aftermath. The city's police chief publicly apologized and announced reforms, including racial equity training and stricter accountability for officers. Charles, now a symbol of justice, began speaking at national forums. This case isn't just a victory, it's a call to continue fighting for justice, he said at one event. A moment of reflection at the cafe where it all began, Charles met with Maya. "You've inspired so many people," Maya said, smiling as she handed him a cup of coffee. Charles nodded. "Inspiration is just the beginning. Real change has to last." Maya handed him an envelope. Inside was a nomination for a Civil Rights Award. The story ends with hope. Change is possible when people unite against injustice and refuse to back down.